Hello everyone and welcome to another edition of the International Issues video lecture series. I'm your Professor Glenn Torres-Spelliscy. Thanks for joining. This week our topic is confronting non-state actors with a focus on America's longest war, the conflict in Afghanistan with the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. For my generation, it is a moment that we will always remember. It was a definitional moment, like other moments before it. A moment that made us focus on who we were and what we believed. It was a moment that forever altered American perceptions about the world and our role in it.
And in a sense, the sort of the theme that comes through repeatedly for me is that 9/11 changed everything. It changed the way we think about threats to the United States. It changed about our recognition of our vulnerabilities. It changed in terms of the kind of national security strategy we need to pursue in terms of guaranteeing the safety and security of the American people. So on the one hand, I'm sure everybody wants to get back to normal, and we have in many respects. But on the other hand, we all have to recognize as a nation that 9/11 changed a great deal in our lives.
The stability that had characterized the post-Cold War era in the United States will be lost on that morning in September. There were changes that every American experienced in their daily lives, including enhanced security measures at airports and places of business. But there was also a fundamental shift in how we understood the world from a legal perspective. And this shift was perhaps most evident in the ways that the United States sought to respond to the attacks. The non-state extremist group Al-Qaeda had planned and carried out the attacks, but they would not be the only party to be held responsible by the United States. In October 2001, the United States invaded the nation of Afghanistan, initiating a paradigm shift in how international law dealt with conflicts involving both state and non-state actors. You see, prior to the engagement in Afghanistan, states generally were not considered responsible for the actions of non-state actors, even when those actors were operating from within their territory. This was based on the international legal doctrine of imputability, which provides that states can only be held responsible for acts that were either committed under their authority or at least under the color of their authority. If you had a bad actor on your soil, traditionally, the sole duty imposed on the state was the obligation to try to arrest those individuals accused of the crimes, if the circumstances permitted. But with the advent of the war on terror, this old understanding changed. In the new international paradigm ushered in by the Bush administration in the wake of the attacks, states were now to be held responsible for actions of non-state actors who were simply on their territory. That was a new understanding in international law. The idea was that even the mildest support could and should lead to culpability.
The Taliban must act and act immediately. They will hand over the terrorists, or they will share in their fate. The enemy of America is not our many Muslim friends. It is not our many Arab friends. Our enemy is a radical network of terrorists and every government that supports them.
Now, importantly, this was not always the U.S. position. As is discussed in the lecture, the responsibility of states for terrorist activities had previously been limited by the International Court of Justice. In Nicaragua versus the United States, the Nicaraguan government had sued the U.S. for supporting anti-communist rebel groups known as the Contras. The Contras were responsible for numerous war crimes, and the Nicaraguan government had sought to hold the U.S. responsible for supporting the group through funding and training. The ICJ, however, held that support was not enough. And for decades, the international community accepted that premise. A state could not be held responsible for the actions of a non-state actor unless they had effective control over the actor, which is a much higher standard than simple support. This standard of control would be emphasized by international legal tribunals for the next 2 decades. But that changed with the invasion of Afghanistan. For the first time, a major nation was arguing that support alone could lead to responsibility. Now, the story of Al-Qaeda in the United States is a complicated one. Too many politicians resort to meaningless platitudes saying that Al-Qaeda hates our freedoms, but the conflict between the United States and Al-Qaeda has deeper, more complicated roots. It begins with the rise of the Mujahideen, a non-state actor that sought to expel the Soviet Union from Afghanistan in the 1980s. The US, under Presidents Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan, supported the efforts of the Mujahideen through arms supplies, with the purpose of destabilizing Soviet influence in the region. One of the Mujahideen that fought in Afghanistan was the son of a wealthy Saudi family, Osama bin Laden. Now, the end of the Soviet invasion led to a civil war in Afghanistan, with the Taliban ultimately emerging as victorious in 1996. At about the same point in time that the Taliban seized power in Afghanistan, they began to forge increasing ties with another militant Islamic group, Al-Qaeda, which was being led by bin Laden. In the years following the Soviet withdrawal, bin Laden had become enraged at US policies towards Arab states in the Middle East, in particular the presence of US troops in Saudi Arabia and the effects of sanctions on the Muslim population in Iraq. Throughout the 1990s, bin Laden issued a series of fatwas against US interests and civilians, seeking to change US policies. Then in 1998, Al-Qaeda was directly responsible for attacks on US embassies in Africa. In 2000, it attacked the USS Cole anchored in Yemen. The attacks culminated in 2001 with the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. The US response was Operation Enduring Freedom. When Operation Enduring Freedom was launched in October 2001, the game plan of Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Casey, was to have a light footprint, with only a minimal number of US troops. But Afghanistan, as the Soviets had learned, would not be easily conquered. As violence increased, the US began a surge of troops to the region, culminating in newly elected President Barack Obama's decision to send an additional 50,000 troops in 2009, raising the total to nearly 100,000. That surge would continue until 2011, when a few months after President Obama announced the killing of Osama bin Laden by US Special Forces in Pakistan, he announced the start of a planned withdrawal of US forces in Afghanistan.
Starting next month, we will be able to remove 10,000 of our troops from Afghanistan by the end of this year, and we will bring home a total of 33,000 troops by next summer, fully recovering the surge I announced at West Point. After this initial reduction, our troops will continue coming home at a steady pace as Afghan security forces move into the lead. Our mission will change from combat to support. By 2014, this process of transition will be complete, and the Afghan people will be responsible for their own security.
This was a critical moment in the policy debate. The killing of bin Laden by US Special Forces was the culmination of the mission against Al-Qaeda. Even before the Obama administration tracked down bin Laden in Abbottabad, Pakistan, US forces had already severely degraded Al-Qaeda's capabilities and leadership. The organization was a shell of its former self, and for many in the administration, including Vice President Biden, the killing of bin Laden was a significant milestone and signified a transition in the mission. The US, though, maintained that it would not abandon Afghanistan, as it had been accused of doing following the Soviet War, which ultimately led to the Taliban seizing power. Rather, the US would pursue a gradual withdrawal strategy, eventually transferring full power to the elected Afghan government and hopefully leaving a well-trained and well-equipped Afghan military to defend the country. The end goal of US policy was to leave a stable Afghanistan that was no longer a refuge for extremist non-state actors like Al-Qaeda. It was the Obama administration that first entertained the possibility that peace with the Taliban might be possible given certain conditions, and negotiations began. The Trump administration would continue the policy, and after years of fitful negotiations, it was the Trump administration that was finally successful in reaching a peace agreement with the Taliban. In January 2019, Chief U.S. Negotiator Zalmay Khalilzad announced that American and Taliban officials have agreed in principle to the framework of a deal in which the insurgents would guarantee Afghan territory is never used by terrorists, which could lead to a full pullout of American troops in return for larger concessions from the Taliban. On February 29, 2020, a peace agreement between the Taliban and the United States was signed, proposing a way to end the nearly 2 decades of conflict between the two parties. The U.S. promised a full withdrawal by May 1, 2021, in return for promises that the Taliban would never again allow its territory to be used by non-state extremist actors that sought to attack the US or its interests. The US-Taliban peace deal, however, was to be only the first step of the process. The next key phase was to be negotiations between the elected Afghan government and the Taliban to bring an end to the long-running civil war, and this is where the potential for peace was lost. The Taliban showed no real interest in reaching a negotiated solution with the sitting Afghan government. Negotiations were delayed from the outset, and the Trump administration was not able to push the peace process forward in any significant way. Then, as the Biden administration assumed power in January 2021, and with the May 1st, 2021 deadline approaching and negotiations between the two parties stalled, the new president was faced with a choice: to generally respect the terms of the agreement and continue the U.S. withdrawal, or to re-engage with the Taliban in another bloody spring offensive. President Biden announced his intention in April 2021, stating that although the U.S. would not meet the May 1st deadline imposed in the agreement, the U.S. would complete a full troop withdrawal by the 20th anniversary of the September 11th attacks. Let's listen to President Biden announce the new plan.
We went to Afghanistan in 2001 to root out al-Qaeda, to prevent future terrorist attacks against the United States planned from Afghanistan. Our objective was clear. The cause was just. Our NATO allies and partners rallied beside us. And I supported that military action along with overwhelming majority of the members of Congress. More than 7 years later, in 2008, weeks before we swore the oath of office, President Obama and I were about to swear, President Obama asked me to travel to Afghanistan and report back on the state of the war in Afghanistan. I flew to Afghanistan, to the Kunar Valley, a rugged mountainous region on the border with Pakistan. What I saw on that trip reinforced my conviction that only the Afghans have the right and responsibility to lead their country, and that more and endless American military force could not create or sustain a durable Afghan government. I believed that our presence in Afghanistan should be focused on the reason we went in the first place: to ensure Afghanistan would not be used as a base from which to attack our homeland again. We did that. We accomplished that objective. I said, among with others, we'd follow Osama bin Laden to the gates of hell if need be. That's exactly what we did, and we got him. It took us close to 10 years to put President Obama's commitment into form, and that's exactly what happened. Osama bin Laden was gone. That was 10 years ago. Think about that. We delivered justice to bin Laden a decade ago, and we've stayed in Afghanistan for a decade since. Since then, our reasons for remaining in Afghanistan have become increasingly unclear, even as the terrorist threat that we went to fight evolved. Over the past 20 years, the threat has become more dispersed, metastasizing around the globe. Al-Shabaab in Somalia, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, al-Nusra in Syria, ISIS is attempting to create a caliphate in Syria and Iraq and establishing affiliates in multiple countries in Africa and Asia. With the terror threat now in many places, keeping thousands of troops grounded and concentrated in just one country at the cost of billions each year makes little sense to me and to our leaders. We cannot continue the cycle of extending or expanding our military presence in Afghanistan, hoping to create ideal conditions for the withdrawal and expecting a different result. I'm now the fourth United States president to preside over American troop presence in Afghanistan. 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats. I will not pass this responsibility on to a fifth. After consulting closely with our allies and partners, with our military leaders and intelligence personnel, with our diplomats and our development experts, with the Congress and the Vice President, as well as with Mr. Ghani and many others around the world, I concluded that it's time to end America's longest war. It's time for American troops to come home.
As the U.S. began to withdraw its forces in May 2021, the Taliban seized the opportunity and began to take new territory. President Biden stood by his decision.
So let me ask those who want us to stay. How many thousands more Americans' daughters and sons were you willing to risk? How long would you have them stay? Already we have members of our military whose parents fought in Afghanistan 20 years ago. Would you send their children and their grandchildren as well? Would you send your own son or daughter? After 20 years, $1 trillion spent training and equipping hundreds of thousands of Afghan national security and defense forces. 2,448 Americans killed, 20,722 more wounded, and untold thousands coming home with unseen trauma to their mental health. I will not send another generation of Americans to war in Afghanistan with no reasonable expectation of achieving a different outcome.
And with American withdrawal seemingly guaranteed, the Taliban picked up the pace of their attacks, venturing further and further into government-controlled territory all over the country. On August 2, 2021, Afghan President Ghani addressed the parliament, acknowledging the Taliban advances and blaming the U.S.'s withdrawal for the precarious situation in the country.
ما د امریکا جمهور رئیس ته ویل چې فکر ته درناوی لرم ځکه د هغوی فیصله وه خو زه پوهېدم چې دا فکر ځینې پایلې لري او د خطرونو مدیریت به د افغانانو په غاړه واچول سي.
Within 10 days, Kabul was surrounded. A few days later, the Taliban seized control and President Ghani fled the country. The U.S. began an unprecedented airlift and evacuation to rescue U.S. citizens and local allies, eventually flying over 100,000 people to safety in only 2 weeks. By August 31, 2021, the U.S. had concluded the formal evacuation mission and had fully withdrawn. That night, President Biden once again addressed the nation.
Last night in Kabul, the United States ended 20 years of war in Afghanistan, the longest war in American history. We completed one of the biggest airlifts in history, with more than 120,000 people evacuated to safety. That number is more than double what most experts thought were possible. No nation has ever done anything like it in all of history. Only the United States had the capacity and the will and ability to do it, and we did it today. In April, I made a decision to end this war. As part of that decision, we set the date of August 31st for American troops to withdraw. The assumption was that more than 300,000 Afghan national security forces that we had trained over the past 2 decades and equipped would be a strong adversary in their civil wars with the Taliban. That assumption that the Afghan government would be able to hold on for a period of time beyond military drawdown turned out not to be accurate.
The pace of the Taliban victory had been staggering, and the lack of pushback by the Afghan military had been sobering. For the past 2 decades, 4 administrations, Democrat and Republican, had spent American time, blood, and resources in an attempt to establish a stable democracy in the country, and it had collapsed in mere weeks. This week's lesson will focus on the wisdom of the peace deal with the Taliban and the Biden administration's withdrawal under the terms of the agreement. One of the things to ponder is what lessons can be learned about the conflict and the way it ended with respect to potential limits of American military and diplomatic power. In the post-9/11 era, the U.S. engaged in a series of wars and conflicts designed to root out terrorist actors and the states that supported them. These missions morphed into policies that sought to impose democratic structures following military conflict. We saw this in Libya, Iraq, and Afghanistan. In almost every situation, the policy failed, and we need to think about why that is and what effects it should have on our future foreign policy choices. Well, that's it for today's introductory podcast. Go on to read the materials for this week, and I will see you on the discussion board.